Writing philosophy. So let me sort of give you a sense of some ways that I think about writing, which will kind of then allow me to talk about different approaches. So I often think about writing as sort of a stair-step process, right? This is the process-oriented writing we always think about. But I think it's really important, especially now, to make sure that you give your students short, informal assignments. And I often spend a lot of time trying to build some interactive peer-to-peer assignments. And I'm going to give you examples of all these. So I'm not just throwing these out and leaving you in the ether. Research especially is a really hard thing both for you to teach and for your students to do. So I try to build it in components, and I'll make some suggestions about that that go beyond the make an outline, do a bibliography, do the research, right? We all know how to do that. You've been told how to do that. We know it works sometimes, but not always if you can get them involved. But there's other ways to proceed potentially. Another thing that I really encourage is writing about a variety of genres, especially those genres where students are authorities. Way back in the day when I was in graduate school in the 90s, I used to teach in freshman comp how to write. The first assignment would be to do an interpretation of a music video, because I found that they were experts on like looking at a music video and knowing what to do with that. But if you gave them a short story or poem, they cratered. So think about what they're the authority of, and then think about how to build that into your writing assignments. And finally, I want to end by telling you about some of the creative assignments that I've added, and I'm starting to see these used more and more. In fact, I pulled an example that I just saw go through on Twitter today. So those are the three sort of areas I'm going to talk about. So first of all, stair-step writing. Oh, and by the way, I should mention, if you have questions as we go along, put them in the chat. So let's think about this idea of stair-step writing. I try to ground each of these within the TEKS because I know that's what you're held accountable for. I know we don't all love the TEKS, but there are ways to meet the goals of the TEKS and to have creativity in the classroom as well that your students will respond to. The TEKS, of course, emphasizes this idea of process, right? Of listening, speaking, reading, and writing and thinking. And they talk about it being recursive. In other words, you might do something over and over again to improve the writing. So thinking about that as a process, I like to think about it as stair-step writing. So I'm going to show you my syllabus, and what you'll see is that every big assignment is actually a bunch of little assignments. And that's really important because if you break things into little pieces, you avoid procrastination, right? These are the students that are trying to write their big paper the night before and have no idea what they're doing. If you do it in little pieces, hopefully when they get to the final stages, they'll have a lot of it done. Working small to large so it doesn't feel overwhelming to them and they drop out. Making sure you have some peer-to-peer interaction because they can often help themselves. And breaking the research into these little small pieces, which I'm going to talk a bit more about. Okay. All right. Along with this, when I talk about these multiple components, one of the things I do is take these big projects. So if you look in this assignment, you'll see that I really only have 2 exams, a course project, and some class responses. So that's not a lot. That's not a lot of grading. But what I've done with that course project, even though it's worth 50% of the grade, if you look down toward the bottom, I've taken that 50% and broken it into small components. And what you'll see with those components is some of them are kind of give me assignments just to get them going, just to get them started. So I'm going to talk about each of these pieces as we move along, but the research analysis is a piece that's kind of like, if you just do it, we want you to participate, you're going to do well. And I find that kind of primes the pump. And once they get the one thing going on the project, then the rest kind of follow along. All right. The other thing to be said with this is that as you're working small to large, right, here's another example of this. How do we do this? We have an archive assignment which has all these little pieces. So I have a blog post, which I'll show you in a minute, a survey form, which is just short answer. They don't have to do all the things they would in a more formalized paper. So these are more informal, more colloquial. They actually do a sort of digital entry and then they get to the paper. So what I've tried to do, as you can see with both of these assignments, with this one and the previous one, is even with these big chunks of assignments, only half of it is formal writing. I found that's really important over the years to make sure, yes, you have your formal writing in there, but you give them a chance to shine in other ways too. All right, so here's one assignment that would be a more informal writing. This is one of those small bits I use to get them started. One of the things we do is this university archive assignment. So I take my students into our university archives and they all pick an item. It's a really fun way to get them involved with the archives. I do this in lots of different classes. This particular assignment is written for my Texas Lit class. So they go in and they find something about Texas. It might be a poem, it might be a painting, it might be some of them like the Battle of San Jacinto cannonballs. You know, they get very excited about the cannonball. Oh, that's what I want to write about. But I really just want to get them started thinking about this assignment. So we do this very basic, just tell me and your classmates about your experience. And I grade it A to F. And I want it to be a coherent paragraph with a clear topic, sentence, and examples, but they're the authority. I'm asking them to write about what they learned from being in this archive. And again, very simple. Mostly they do it. Mostly they get A's. It's priming the pump for when the harder work comes as we move through the assignments. The other thing I found is really successful to build into classes are class responses where students have a bit of responsibility. And I know this seems a bit daunting on the high school level, say, but if you work with them, they can really be authorities on the assignments. So for my African-American Lit class, I have students sign up for 2 class responses. And I ask them to do some preparation work to read the assignment. And you can see this is very simple stuff. Just read it, give me a paragraph that tells me about the crucial issues, what's important, find a support item, and this is really important, a picture, a song, a map, another sort of visual item that relates to that material, and then come up with some questions that you want to ask your classmates. And I then read through that and incorporate it into the class. And I tell the students, I'll be looking at you every once in a while and asking you to respond, especially if your classmates are quiet. This is a really good thing to do because they start to work to help each other because nobody wants to see their classmate put on the spot. But it also makes them sort of think a little bit more deeply about just a few assignments. So I encourage these sort of peer-to-peer responsibilities. Another peer-to-peer assignment that I just started in the age of COVID, and I love it. I actually think it's working really well, and I've seen other folks talk about this as well. I've started using a free piece of software called Hypothesis, and I can show you more in question answer if you're interested in this. What it does is allow close readings of the text and conversations between the students. Here's what it looks like. It's a free piece of software. It's a little plugin on their browser. And again, I recognize not all of you are going to have computer classrooms, right? So there could be a limitation right there. But if you have a few computers, you could put them in groups to do this assignment. So 3 or 4 annotating. And what I ask them to do is to read through the piece and to highlight certain sections and give me a piece of analysis or discussion or ask a question. And I try to get them started. I say to them things like, think of the rhythm of this poem as a blues piece. Try reading it out loud. And some of them, they're like, oh, I went and I looked this word up that I didn't know. Some of them say, oh, this is really interesting. I understand how the blues works. And you can see the highlights. And what you see is the darker highlighted items are parts of the poem or the text where lots of students have talked about it. The clearer areas are places where they're not responding at all. And what I found is students start talking to each other because they're reading each other's comments and trying to find a place they put their own. So this is really great, especially if you are online and you have a hard time getting discussion going. I've had my students do this ahead of time, and then I pull pieces of it and I say, I saw you guys were talking about this a lot. Let's look at that again. And, RJ, I saw you mention this especially. Can you talk to me about the kinds of questions you had as you were looking at this section? So it allows them to do a little of the pre-thinking work to make the meeting, when you have the meeting time, go a little better. In terms of breaking things into small pieces as well, when you're teaching research, there's nothing wrong with asking them to do a little pre-strategizing and to plan things out. I've actually found this is one of the best assignments I do, because if you tell students go do research, they're like, I don't know. So what we do is we spend time talking about how to do research. And then usually, they forget it and it's the night before and they're trying to find something. But instead of doing that, I say to them, I'm going to make you practice research and write down your strategy. And I use something that one of my colleagues has developed, where she talks about this sort of idea of humanities research strategies. And I've given you this handout. If you want to use it, it's great. So when we talk about searching, say use Google Scholar, or say use your library website to do searching, they often just go, okay, it's Google. I throw a bunch of words in and something pops out and I don't know what to do with that. This is sort of thinking through a strategy about how you're going to find the information before you start. And I often have them prepare ahead of time and talk to each other about, okay, I'm trying to find something on Frederick Douglass and manhood. I don't even know where to start. What could I do? And they work together to sort of say, well, she said you could use these kinds of keywords, or you could sort by dates because she said we have to have new resources. So you start to sort of think about how you can break things into these small pieces. I lead up to an annotated bibliography project like a lot of us do. The main reason I do this, honestly, is I want to see their citations before they give them to me in the paper. I want to see, first of all, that they looked at stuff, and second of all, that they have a clue on how to cite things. So this is a very old school assignment, but I've incorporated it, but I don't use this as a first step. If you do an annotated bibliography as a first step of research, students are lost. They don't even know where to begin. So just some thinking, especially for your higher level classes, is there something you can put before the citation forms? Because, they don't know how to do those and they struggle. Even when you show them over and over again, they struggle with that. So what can you put before that step to help them? All right, so those are just some small pieces and we can talk more about them later. You have the handouts. I want to really sort of push you to think creatively about the kinds of genres you're asking them to work with. Students seem to balk at long works, they balk at poetry. Short stories are a little easier, but still they're very resistant. And the TEKS does emphasize multiple genres, right? They say, oh, please look at different kinds of genres. Think about multimodal, think about digital text, you have lots of options. And so I take that seriously in my classroom. And one of the things that I found really helpful, and this is an assignment that I do in my Texas Lit class, but could do actually very well in my African American Lit and American Lit classes as well, is I have them actually write an informal analysis of a piece of music. And they sign up for a Texas song that they want to analyze. And it's really interesting because the students that hate poetry will totally get into this assignment. And so I tell them, find a picture, find a sound file or YouTube of this song. Tell me about the lyrics. Tell me about if there's images to go with it. How do you analyze it? And students that usually give me like a small paragraph, sometimes they'll spend like paragraphs responding to, their favorite song by, I don't know, Willie Nelson. Willie Nelson, I love Willie Nelson. I'm going to spend hours telling you about this particular song. And so it's a good way to engage students that are more resistant. Thinking about music, which obviously leads into poetry, you might also think a little more creatively about other forms of music. In my Texas Lit class, I've had a lot of success with looking at cowboy songs, and we get to talk about the history of collecting of cowboy songs in Texas. I've had a lot of success with corridos. I have students I had one student, it was wonderful. Her grandfather was a singer in a traveling band that did corridos all across the borderlands. And she brought some of his songs to class, and we had a translation and the original, and we worked as a class to work through those lyrics to figure out what was going on there. It was such a productive assignment, and it gave them the confidence they needed that when we got to poetry, they weren't nearly as frightened. And you can see in the middle, other sort of ideas to work with. Folk tales are good. We've done a lot with folk tales as well in the Texas Lit class. So other sort of genres that might be a little more creative. What other genres? I've had great luck with analyzing things like foodways. So I have assignment where we actually pull historical cookbooks and I put them in small groups and have them, come together and analyze what that cookbook is telling us about these various regions and forms. And then they write a short response to this. So all these are sort of more unusual forms. They're all genres. They're all asking for close analysis. Then those skills get transferred. All right, I want to make sure I don't run over time. So I want to spend my final section talking about this sort of idea of project-based learning as I think about it. The TEKS is really big on sort of, explanatory essays, but you can also use things like personal essays, reports. You can use any kind of rhetorical analysis of different genres. Multiple genres is such an important thing in the TEKS, and you can take advantage of that. So instead, I've for a number of years have been moving away from these big long essays because my students really struggle with it even in college. I often have non-English majors, and asking them to write even an 8 to 10 page paper, which would have been sort of de rigueur, the thing we do as a 200, 300 level English class, it really doesn't go well. Now, some students love to do those. They're English majors. This is what they find, exciting and simple. They still have that option, but I've moved to this idea of an unessay. And it's a little more creative response to some of the themes we're working with in the class. And this prompt is in your works and in your materials. An essay is sort of this creative way to engage with these topics. And I do give them a lot of leeway. I guide them, I meet with them, but I say, think about the topics we've worked with this semester. So if it's Texas Lit, we've worked with regionalism, identity, construction of identities in various genres, right? And I say, you can take that idea and present it in multiple ways. And I'm going to evaluate you on how compelling and effective this thing you create is. And I also would like you to write a reflection. So they're still doing a 2 to 3 page paper that's in a reflection on how this, whatever they create, reflects these ideas of what we learned in class and discussed in class. And so what I'm saying is you can do a creative project, but it's not just like make a volcano that, explodes like you did in science class. You have to clearly tie it to ideas we've been talking about in class. And you have to explain to me in your essay what you've learned and how that's represented in this thing you create. So it's very clearly tied to sort of thematics of the class and evaluations of things we've done in the class. And I've gotten amazing things. Just to flip back to this particular slide. So on the corner down there, that's Descaro. One of my students from El Paso made us all tacos and brought them in one day because this was his family's recipe. And he talked about how this was representative of the borderlands. And he used Sandra Cisneros and he used Gloria Anzaldúa. And he tied it to all these literary texts that we talked about. And I thought it was just brilliant. Lots of students got into cookbooks. That Modern South Texas Border Cookbook was really amazing. A student took and created a Spanglish version because we had been talking a lot about language uses and how Anzaldúa talks about these mixed languages like Spanglish on the border. And she did this brilliant cookbook out of sort of those theories and then talked about that in her short essay. We had quilts. I had a student actually create a quilt out of some of her family materials. I had the most wonderful student bring me a box. It was like a little hope chest. And she said, this box is representative of a Latino living on the border. And you opened it. She had included materials from her christening, her first communion, her folklorica shoes, a video of her folklorica dance group. She had included her quince flowers. I mean, it was just, and then she talked about how this particular cultural identity is represented in the literature. So I always make sure that they're not just a project, but that they are connected to whatever your class themes are. This really, I've included some examples of different types of essays that you can point your students to. But this written document is the one that I point to, 1 to 2 to 3 pages. And these are becoming much more popular. In fact, today I saw a faculty member who's at Davidson College just tweet out that she was grading her own essays, and she was teaching Black literature. And here's a great example of an essay. This student took and created an adult ABC book in the vein of 19th century abolitionist children's books. And that was how she kind of interpreted um, the sort of genre of abolitionist children's books that she had been reading all semester. And so these are actually really great ways for your students to think more deeply about things. I think they tend to view long essays as sort of like formulaic, but this actually makes them really think. The other thing that I will say about these is whenever you have a student who's excited about something in the class and they tell their parents or share something with their grandparents, you know they've learned. And I often have students create something and say to me, oh, I'm going to give it to my Nana for Christmas. That's going to be her gift. And I think, okay, this is good. We've taught them something. Now, how do you grade these things? Because that's the thing we always worry about. So here's one person's schematic of grading. Now, I imagine that for high school, you might want to make this more particularized, and it may be more focused on the essay. So, you can include the rubric criteria that you would normally ask regarding essay prompts. Do you have a good, clear thesis? Do you prove your point? But you might also include rubrics of, does it follow a medium that works? Is it well crafted? Can I understand what it's doing? Does it synthesize, right? These are all things that we ask for in different genres that are sort of congruent across this entire set of skills we want to teach our students. So I'm going to stop there.